Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. To some, love is the spirit of poetry. It is the motivating force. There's a poem by Charles Olson which addresses love, which places all where each is. In some ways, love is a motivating force in the Faerie Queene in the 16th century. Certainly the sonnet tradition from its beginnings with Petrarch in Italy, not then maybe the nation of Italy, but all of those love poems to Laura, and adapted into England by Sir Philip Sidney and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, brought to brilliance by them, by Thomas Wyatt, and not too long after by Shakespeare, the Amoretti, which are songs of love by Edmund Spenser. And not all of these poems of love are sweet, beautiful songs of pleasure. There can be much tension in them. Thomas Wyatt's possibly most famous, whoso list to hunt, I know where is an hind. But it's actually a poem about an impossible, forbidden love, and he is older and beyond that hunt, and beyond wanting to lose at the game of love, wanting to have basically a broken heart. I bring this up now in this second podcast, which is about Emily Dickinson's work. I talked recently about her fierceness, the radical nature of her poetry, both formally, with its off rhymes, near rhymes, off meters, its beautiful song, but not any traditional kind of song, and its unusual capitalization I mentioned now, and its dashes at the end of lines, sometimes in the middle, as though one is dashing into and through the poem, and there's barely enough time to get this down. I did bring up what seems to be a love poem of hers, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, where the gun and the gun owner have this relationship in which they almost become one another and certainly serve one another. But possibly my favorite love poem of hers is a poem of impossible love, and not impossible because something bars the potential lovers. Impossible because love is too strong of an experience to even allow one to survive. That is, it is too much. It is, and I think as I read this poem, you'll see that, and then I'll go back to certain parts of it and hopefully elucidate a little bit about it. It is, for Dickinson, one of her longer poems, which means it's perhaps a page and a half in her The Poems of Emily Dickinson, edited by R.W. Franklin. And as I mentioned last time, there are two basic editions and numbering systems for Emily Dickinson's poems. This one is 706 in the Franklin edition, or 640 in the edition edited by Thomas H. Johnson. And just to remind you that Johnson edition, which appeared in 1955, was the first time, a broad public came to understand the poems that she left were, and she didn't publish except for very, very little in her lifetime. So the poems she left when she passed away were in a quite different form than early editions of her work, which had been edited in some way to normalize her. This poem I'm going to look at today seems to me impossible to be normalized. It begins with the line, "I cannot live with you." And that reason why I cannot live with you is that life is kind of a normal thing. People do. People have nice houses with fences around them. They have dinner services. And what she thinks of as life with this you is simply too powerful for that, too strong. It is an unimaginable pleasure. I cannot live with you. It would be life. And life is over there, behind the shelf the sexton keeps the key to, putting up our life, his porcelain, like a cup, discarded of the housewife, quaint or broke. A newer Severus pleases, old ones crack. I could not die with you, for one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. You could not. And I? Could I stand by and see you freeze without my right of frost, death's privilege? Nor could I rise with you, because your face would put out Jesus, that new grace glow plain and foreign on my homesick eye, except that you than he shone closer by. They judge us. How? For you served heaven, you know, or sought to. I could not, because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. And were you lost, I would be, though my name rang loudest on the heavenly fame. And were you saved, and I condemned to be where you were not, that self were hell to me. So we must meet apart, you there, I here, with just the door apart that oceans are, and prayer, and that white sustenance, despair. I tried to pause in that poem between the major parts. That is, there's a three stanza, which basically pulls the statement out, I cannot live with you, and what that means. It means that, life is something of order, that a sexton keeps a key to, that, when things are broken, housewives discard them, you get new things. And that's not what our relationship is about. It is not about that normative order. The second part begins, I could not die with you. And that's actually almost a literally physical thing, because one of us would have to die first. And you are not strong enough. You could not. And I I couldn't stand by and just see you freeze without my rite of frost. In other words, without dying too. So I cannot live with you. I could not die with you. The second part is 2 stanzas. Each stanza in this poem is 4 lines. Next is, nor could I rise with you. And if you think of rising after death being to go into heaven. And why could I not rise with you? And she says, this is extraordinary, because your face would put out Jesus. In other words, you are so much more amazing, empowering to me than Jesus could ever be. In fact, that new grace and with the New Testament, the new word, which is Jesus, would glow plain because I would be homesick for you. I would only be satisfied there if you shone closer by than he. Okay, so nor could I rise with you. The next part is turns the gaze from the outside to them, and it's the outside of those that might be judging, as in heaven. It's they'd judge us. You, and maybe this points to some love object being a minister or at least a religious person, for you served heaven or sought to. But I could not. The author of the poem is not the one who serves heaven, who did not serve heaven because the loved one saturated her sight. And she did not have any eyes for what she calls sordid excellence. In other words, heaven, Jesus, that light seems sordid and not as bright as the object of love in the poem. Okay, the next part starts with, and were you lost? And lost here means fallen, gone to hell, basically. And were you lost? I would be, though my name rang loudest on the heavenly fame. So I could be in heaven, but if you weren't there too, then that would be hell to me. Were you saved and I condemned to be where you were not, condemned to be in heaven, then that were hell to me. So in some ways, this is a blasphemous poem, powerfully so, out of a sense that the true paradise is love, but it's a love so overpowering that it is really impossible. And then the very last, the resolution, if you will, although I think there's a question of whether it is a resolution, is so we must meet apart. You there, I here, with just the door ajar that oceans are. Just the door ajar that oceans are. So that's how close. Just a little bit, but that distance is forever. That oceans are, and prayer. Prayer is like, it doesn't cover that space. And that white sustenance, despair. Throw that all in together, that separation, even just the door ajar, but that little bit is like oceans. It is like space prayer could never transverse. It is a white sustenance we call despair. This is an extremely passionate poem. And expresses desire at its highest moment, at a moment when this desire, this love, makes any normative reality impossible. It makes any heavenly reality impossible. It makes any condemned to hell reality impossible. It makes it so that the only possibility is to say, no, this can't happen. Emily Dickinson, one of the most beautifully moving poets I think anyone could ever read. And I didn't even begin to go into the formal details of this poem, but I will leave that to you. Again, this is poem number 706 in the Franklin edition, or 640 in the Johnson edition. The poem whose first line is, "I cannot live with you." Thank you.